The snow out on the prairie doesn't just fall, it breathes. It covers things you want to forget and reveals things you never knew were there. On a night when the wind was sharp enough to cut glass, it was about to do both. Under the dim, flickering light of a single lantern, a woman sat on the porch of a cabin she'd never seen before. Her name was Minoki, but everyone called her Minnow. She had two little girls, no older than 5, pressed into her sides like tiny birds seeking shelter from a storm. The shawl around them was thin, and the cold was biting deep. Her face, though she was only 26, looked like it had seen 100 winters. Her daughters, Ya and Nay, shivered, their breasts making tiny clouds in the air. They weren't just leaning on their mother for warmth. They were leaning on her because she was the only thing left in the world that felt solid. And then she spoke, her voice not much more than a whisper, but it carried a weight that could break your heart. "No man will accept me with children," she wept into the dark. Her words weren't for anyone, just a broken prayer sent up to a sky that seemed to be made of iron. But someone did hear. From the deepest shadows at the edge of the porch, a shape moved. The sound was slow, deliberate, boots scraping on old timber. A man emerged from the darkness, and he was a giant. Broad shoulders, a stillness about him that made the air itself seem to hold its breath. His name was River McGraw, and he was the kind of man who moved through the world without leaving a trace. He'd spent his whole life being alone, and he liked it that way. But when he saw her there, a ghost in the swirling snow with her two small children, something inside his chest, something he thought had died long ago, gave a hard, painful kick. He'd heard words like hers before, words of despair, but never spoken with such raw, simple truth. He stepped forward, his shadow covering them completely. "But I am here to hold you," he said. His voice was low, like rocks grinding at the bottom of a riverbed. It wasn't a promise of comfort. It sounded more like a vow. Minnow didn't look up. She'd heard promises before. Out here, promises were the first things to freeze and break. Still, his shadow stayed put, a dark shield against the biting wind. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker, not of hope, but of curiosity. Could this be different? She didn't dare believe it, because memory is a wolf, and it was right at her heels. Just weeks ago, she had a home. She was Minnow Callahan, living with her husband's family, in a house filled with the smell of baking bread and the sound of her daughter's laughter. It was a good life, a simple life. Then the fever came. It moved like a wildfire, and it took her husband before she could even say goodbye. One moment he was there, his hand in hers, the next he was gone. And in the silence that followed, everything changed. The family that had called her daughter now looked at her with eyes like cold, dead stones. They said there was no place for a native woman and her half-breed children in their home. The words were like whips. "You are not one of us. Take what is yours and go." What was hers? A single cooking pot, a blanket, and her two girls. She'd walked out the door as it slammed shut behind her, the sound of it echoing the closing of her old life. She walked for days with no destination, just moving away from the hate. She remembered hearing boots in the dark behind her on that first night. Were they coming to drag her back, to finish what they started? The fear had pushed her forward, made her walk until her feet bled. She never knew if they were hunters or saviors, not until she collapsed, right here, on the porch of this forgotten cabin. River McGraw had no reason to open his door. He was a man built of silence and solitude. They called him the Giant Cowboy, a name whispered in the nearby town, not just for his size, but for the heavy quiet he wore like a coat. It was a silence that could make loud, brave men suddenly find a reason to be somewhere else. He lived in this cabin because he was done with the world, and the world, it seemed, was done with him. But when he saw that woman, huddled with her children against a storm that was both outside and inside her, the walls he'd built around his heart started to crack. He saw things other men wouldn't. The way little Ya, the older one, pressed her tiny cold hand to her mother's cheek. The way Nay, the youngest, whispered to her sister, trying to be brave while her own lip trembled. And when Minnow finally looked up at him, her eyes were red from crying, but there was a fire in them, a stubborn pride that refused to be extinguished. In that fire, He saw something he recognized, something he thought he'd buried a long, long time ago. He opened the door wider and simply said, "Come inside." It was a simple act, but it was an act of defiance against the world. And it was an act that was going to cost him everything. The morning light didn't bring warmth, it brought judgment. It came in the form of Sheriff Clay Roar, a man who wore his authority like a cheap suit, 2 sizes too small. He rode up on a tired-looking horse, the creak of his saddle leather loud in the frozen air. He had the squint of a man who believed the world was his to command. He didn't bother knocking. He just stood in River's doorway, his gaze sweeping past the giant cowboy to the woman and children huddled by the small fire inside. His lip curled in a sneer that he probably practiced in a mirror. "We don't keep natives here, McGraw," he said. The words were clipped, rehearsed. He was performing. Behind him, a few townsfolk lingered, their curiosity stronger than their decency. Their whispers were like the rustle of dry leaves. River didn't say a word. He just stood there, his massive frame filling the doorway, blocking the cold and the sheriff's hateful gaze. His silence was louder than any shout. It was a wall, and the sheriff was bouncing right off it. Sheriff Roar shifted his weight, his hand hovering near the pistol on his hip. He wasn't used to being ignored, but he also wasn't stupid enough to push a man of River's size. Not yet. He spat on the ground, turned, and left, the whispers of the townsfolk following him like flies. Inside, Minnow held her daughters tight. She had heard every word. The cabin, which had felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Later that day, she knew she had to try. They needed flour, salt, basic things. She wrapped the girls as best she could and walked the 2 miles into town, feeling the weight of River's silence behind her, a silent promise to watch over them. The feeling was so new, so strange, she didn't know what to make of it. The town was just one muddy street lined with false front buildings, but the eyes that followed her were real. They dug into her skin, sharp and cold. At the general store, the murmurs were just loud enough for her to hear. She should go back where she belongs. Look at them. What's a man like McGray want with her kind? Her youngest, Nay, tugged on her skirt. "Mama, why are they looking at us?" Minnow forced a smile that felt like it was cracking her face. "They're just curious, little one. It's nothing." But her throat burned with a shame that wasn't hers. As she paid for the flour, her hands trembling, the storekeeper wouldn't even meet her eyes. She hurried out, her children clinging to her legs. The world felt hostile, sharp, a place full of jagged edges. She felt the despair creeping back in, the old familiar cold that had nothing to do with the weather. And then a hand came down on her shoulder. It was large and warm, and as steady as a mountain. It was River. He had followed them. He didn't say a word. He just stood beside her, his presence a silent declaration to the entire town. He took the sack of flour from her trembling hands. That one small touch, that simple act, told her everything. He had chosen his side, and in doing so, he had just declared war. The nights got colder. The snow piled up in drifts against the cabin, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf. Inside, a fragile peace had settled, but fear was like frost, seeping into the bones of the little cabin, making everything brittle. One evening, the peace shattered. The oldest girl, Ya, began to cough, a dry, hacking sound that echoed in the small space. Minnow pressed a hand to her forehead. It was burning hot. Her breathing was shallow, ragged. Panic, cold and sharp, ripped through Minnow. She had seen this before. This was the fever. The same fever that had stolen her husband. No, not again. She wouldn't lose another one. She held Ya, rocking her, whispering old lullabies from her own childhood, songs of the river and the stars. But the dread was a living thing, gnawing at her insides. The girl's breaths grew shorter, weaker. Minnow looked at River, her eyes wide with a terror that needed no words. River had been watching, his face carved from stone. Suddenly he stood up. He threw on his heavy coat, grabbed a rifle from the corner, and without a single word he walked out the door and into the blizzard. The door closed, and the sound of the storm rushed in to fill the silence. Hours passed. Each one was an eternity. Minnow held her daughter, listening to the rattling in her chest, listening to the rage of the wind. She felt helpless, trapped. Had he abandoned them? Had the town's hatred finally driven him away? The thought was a fresh stab of pain. Of course. Why would he stay? She was a burden, a curse. The words of her in-laws echoed in her head. Just as the last embers in the fireplace were dying down, the door burst open. River stumbled in, covered in snow, a ghost returning from the dead. His beard was caked with ice. There was a fresh, dark bruise blooming across his cheek, and his knuckles were split and bleeding. He looked like he'd been through a war, but in his hands he held a small, dark bottle. Medicine. He didn't speak. He just knelt down and placed the bottle in her hands. His voice, when it came, was as quiet as the snow falling outside. "She'll be fine now." Minnow looked from the bottle to his battered face. She reached out and pressed her hand against his arm, feeling the solid strength of him. He didn't explain where he'd been or who he'd fought, and she didn't ask. In that moment, she understood. His silence wasn't emptiness. It was a language all its own, and it spoke of a loyalty she thought had vanished from the earth. In her chest, something that had been frozen for months began to thaw. But she had no idea the price he had just paid for that little bottle of medicine, or the debt that would soon come due. The fever broke. Little Ya's breathing eased, and the color returned to her cheeks. A fragile peace, real this time, settled over the cabin. It was a peace bought with bruised knuckles and a silent promise. The days that followed were quiet, almost gentle. River, the silent giant, would sit by the fire for hours, carving small animals out of scraps of wood. He carved a deer for Ya and a bear for Nay. The girls who had been living in the shadow of fear for so long started to laugh again. Their giggles were a sound that chased the ghosts out of the cabin's dark corners. Minnow, in turn, began to mend things. She took River's coat, the one he wore out into the storm, and carefully stitched the rips and tears. Her fingers were patient, her stitches small and neat. As she worked, she wasn't just mending cloth. She was mending something between them, weaving trust from the frayed threads of their broken lives. They started to talk. Not about the past, not about the pain, but small things. She told him stories her grandmother had told her, stories of the spirits in the rivers and the language of the trees. He told her about the endless plains on cattle drives, about the strange constellations of stars in skies far from here. There were no grand declarations, no flowery words, just these small, shared moments. A cup of hot broth passed from his hands to hers. The way he'd look up from his carving and watch her daughters play, a faint, almost invisible smile on his face. They were building something, slowly, carefully, a home. But outside the four walls of that cabin, the world was not at peace. Sheriff Roar had not forgotten his humiliation. The sight of River's bruised knuckles, seen in town the day after the storm, was a public insult. River hadn't just gotten medicine, he'd taken it. The town's doctor, a timid man named Elias, had refused to sell to a native, following the sheriff's orders. So River had paid the doctor a visit. He hadn't laid a hand on the old man. He'd simply walked into the back room, taken what he needed, and left enough money on the counter to pay for it twice over. The fight had come later, with two of the sheriff's deputies who thought they could enforce Roar's will with their fists. They were wrong. Now the sheriff's whispers were spreading through the town like poison. He wasn't just a bigot, he was a snake. He told people that River McGraw was a dangerous man, an outlaw hiding out. He said the woman was a witch who had put a spell on him. He said her children were a blight. And people, scared and small-minded, began to listen. Men started gathering at the saloon, their talk growing louder, angrier. Hatred is a fire, and in a town as dry and empty as this one, it doesn't take much to start a blaze. Minnow saw it in the eyes of the trappers who passed by the cabin, their gazes lingering too long. She heard it in the sudden silence when she walked by the blacksmith's shop. The fragile peace was an illusion. It was the calm before a storm far worse than any blizzard. And then, one night the storm broke. It arrived under a sky black and moonless, swallowed by a fresh fall of snow. Minnow woke with a jolt. It wasn't a loud noise, but a wrong one, the crunch of too many boots on the snow outside. She crept to the window and peered through a crack in the wood. What she saw made her blood run cold. Torches, a dozen of them, maybe more, held by dark figures moving through the trees surrounding the cabin. They moved like a pack of wolves, their shadows dancing and leaping in the fiery light. At their head was Sheriff Clay Roar. His face was twisted with a vicious, triumphant grin. He raised a hand, and the mob stopped. His voice rang out, sharp and cruel, cutting through the night. "McGraw, send the woman out. Send her out, or we'll burn this place to the ground with all of you in it." River was already awake, standing by the door, his rifle in his hand. He looked calm, impossibly calm. He turned to Minnow. "Take the girls. The floorboard by the hearth is loose. Hide under there. Don't make a sound." But Minnow shook her head. The woman who had arrived on this porch weeks ago, broken and weeping, was gone. She looked him straight in the eye, the fire he'd first seen in them, now a raging blaze. "I will not run again," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. It was as solid and unyielding as the frozen earth beneath them. River looked at her for a long, silent moment. He saw the truth in her eyes. He saw her strength, and it mirrored his own. He gave a single, sharp nod. Then he turned, unbarred the door, and stepped out onto the porch. The snow swirled around him, catching the torchlight, making him look like a figure from an old legend. He didn't raise his rifle. He just stood there, his hands empty at his sides. "This is my home," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried over the jeers of the crowd. It was as steady and final as a church bell tolling at a funeral. "They stay." For a heartbeat, there was silence. The mob was stunned by his defiance. Then the sheriff's angry face appeared from the crowd. "This ain't your home, McGraw. It belongs to the town, and we want it cleansed." From somewhere in the crowd, a man shouted, "Let's burn 'em out!" A rock flew through the air, smashing the window of the cabin. The girls screamed, and then a gunshot cracked through the night. It wasn't from the mob. It was from River's rifle, but he hadn't been holding it. Minnow stood in the doorway, the long rifle in her hands, smoke curling from the barrel. She hadn't aimed at anyone. She had fired into the sky, a warning, a declaration. The mob froze. They had come for a helpless woman. They had not expected this. That's when the chaos erupted. The sheriff, enraged, drew his own pistol. "You'll pay for that," he screamed. But before he could fire, River moved. He wasn't a man anymore. He was an avalanche. He launched himself off the porch and into the crowd. He moved with a speed and brutal efficiency that was terrifying. It wasn't the wild swinging of a bar fighter. Every move was precise, calculated. A broken arm here, a dislocated shoulder there. He wasn't trying to kill them. He was dismantling them. Men shouted. A torch was dropped, and the dry wood of the porch instantly caught fire. Flames licked up the side of the cabin wall. Inside, Minnow didn't panic. She grabbed a heavy blanket, soaked it in their water barrel, and threw it over the flames, her movements quick and sure. She herded the terrified girls away from the fire, whispering to them, "Stay calm. Your father is strong. We are strong." "Your father," the words came out before she even realized it. Outside, the fight was a whirlwind of motion. The townsfolk were no match for River. He moved through them like a force of nature. But the sheriff was smarter than the rest. He stayed back, waiting for his moment. He saw River turn to throw another man aside, leaving his back exposed for a split second. The sheriff raised his pistol, a grin spreading across his face. This was it. But he never pulled the trigger. A clang of metal echoed through the snowy clearing. The sheriff cried out and dropped his gun, clutching a hand that was suddenly bent at a very wrong angle. Standing behind him, her face grim, was Minnow. She held the cast iron skillet from her kitchen, its edge dented from the impact with the sheriff's wrist. Sheriff Roar stared at her, then at his broken hand, his face a mask of disbelief and agony. The fight drained out of the mob. Seeing their leader brought down not by the giant, but by the small woman they had come to torment, broke their spirit completely. They began to scatter, melting back into the woods, leaving their torches sputtering in the snow. Soon only the sheriff was left, kneeling in the snow, cradling his ruined hand, his humiliation complete. River walked over to him, his chest heaving. He didn't say a word. He just looked down at the pathetic man. The look was enough. Sheriff Roar scrambled to his feet and ran, stumbling into the darkness. The silence that fell was profound. The only sounds were the crackle of the dying fire and the soft hiss of snow falling on the hot wood. River turned and walked back to the cabin. There was a long, deep gash on his arm, blood soaking his sleeve, dark against the white snow. He looked at Minnow, at the skillet still in her hand, at the fierce protective fire in her eyes. He stumbled on the top step, his strength finally giving out. He fell forward and she caught him. She held the weight of the giant in her arms, her strength a match for his. And in the smoking ruins of their home, surrounded by the silence of the prairie, they held each other as if they had been doing it their entire lives. They had won the battle. But they both knew the war was far from over, because the sheriff wasn't just a bigot. He was working for someone, and those people would be coming next. In the days that followed the failed attack, a strange quiet fell over the valley. The snow kept falling, bearing the tracks of the mob, covering the scorch marks on the side of the cabin. It was as if the prairie itself was trying to hide the ugliness of what had happened. Inside, things were different. The space was no longer just a shelter. It was a fortress. Minnow cleaned and bandaged the gash on River's arm. Her touch was gentle, but her eyes were hard. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp resolve. River watched her, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. He had offered her protection, but he was starting to realize she had a strength he'd never seen before, a strength forged in loss and survival. They knew the sheriff would not let this go. He was a man whose only asset was his pride, and they had shattered it. A man like that doesn't just leave. He plots. He waits. He finds bigger dogs to join his hunt. "He'll be back," Minnow said one evening, looking out the newly repaired window into the endless white. It wasn't a question. "I know," River replied, his voice a low rumble, "but not alone." This was the first time they had spoken directly about the danger. The unspoken truth now lay between them, and it changed things. The small, quiet moments of carving and sewing were replaced by a tense watchfulness. River began spending his days circling the cabin, checking sightlines, reinforcing the door. He taught Minnow how to properly load and fire the rifle, not just as a warning shot, but to hit a target. Her hands were steady. Her eye was true. One afternoon as the girls napped, he found her staring at a small, simple locket she wore around her neck. It was tarnished silver, the only thing she had left of her husband. "He gave this to me," she said softly, her thumb tracing the worn surface. "He said it would keep me safe." She gave a short, bitter laugh. It didn't do him much good. River looked at the locket. It was plain except for a strange, intricate pattern etched around the edge. It wasn't a floral design. It looked more like a map or some kind of writing. "Can I see it?" he asked. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded, slipping it over her head. He took it in his massive hand. The locket felt impossibly small. He turned it over and over, his brow furrowed. The markings were deliberate. They meant something. "My husband. Before he died," Minnow began, her voice barely a whisper. "He was acting strange. He was scared. His family, the Callahans, they're powerful people. They own half the territory. But he said they were wrong, that their wealth was built on a lie." River's head snapped up. "The Callahans? Silas Callahan is your father-in-law?" Minnow nodded, confused by his reaction. His face had gone pale under his beard. The name had hit him like a physical blow. The silence in the room suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. "River, what is it? Do you know them?" He didn't answer right away. He just stared at the locket, his mind clearly miles away, back in a past he had tried to bury. "The Callahans," he finally said, his voice strained. "They don't just own land. They devour it. And anyone who gets in their way." He pried at the edge of the locket with his thumbnail. There was a click, a false back. He popped it open. It wasn't a space for a picture. Inside, protected by a thin piece of glass, wasn't a portrait or a lock of hair. It was a tiny, tightly folded piece of paper, covered in the same strange symbols that were etched on the outside. It wasn't a letter. It looked like a ledger entry, a series of numbers and symbols. "What is it?" Minnow breathed. "I don't know," River said, his eyes dark with a grim certainty. "But I think this is why your husband is dead, and I think it's what the Callahans are really after." He looked from the paper to her face. The sheriff isn't just a local problem, Minnow. He's a messenger boy. He's been sending word to them. And that quiet out there, it isn't peace. It's the silence before an army arrives. He closed the locket with a snap. And they're not just coming for you. They're coming for me, too. The revelation hung in the air, thick and cold. The Callahans. The name landed like a stone in Minnow's gut. Her husband's family, the people who had smiled at her wedding and held her children, only to cast her out like trash. She had assumed their cruelty was born of grief and prejudice. But this was something else entirely. This was a darkness that had been there all along. "What do they have to do with you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. River finally looked at her, and she saw the ghost of a different man in his eyes. A man who was not a simple, silent cowboy. A man who had seen the worst of the world. "Before I came here," he said slowly, "I wore a badge, U.S. Marshal. My job was to hunt men like Silas Callahan, men who thought they were above the law. I spent a year building a case against him, for land fraud, murder, things that could see him hang." He paused, the memory painful. "I got close, too close. They laid a trap. My partner, he didn't make it. They framed me for it, put a price on my head. I've been running ever since. I came here because it was the one place on the map nobody cared about. I changed my name. I became a ghost." Now it all made sense. His silence, his skill in the fight, the way he seemed to see 10 moves ahead. He wasn't hiding from the world. He was hiding from the Callahans, and she had led them right to his door. "So they're coming for both of us," she said, the reality of their situation settling in. They weren't just outcasts. They were fugitives. "They are," River confirmed. "And Sheriff Rohr, he's not just their messenger. I put him in prison once, for extortion, in Kansas. He must have gotten out, drifted here. He would have recognized me the moment he saw me. He's not just doing this for Callahan's money. This is his revenge." The web was intricate, a dozen threads of hate and greed all leading to this tiny cabin in the middle of nowhere. It was overwhelming. But as Minnow looked at the coated paper from the locket, then at her sleeping children, a strange calm washed over her. The questions were gone. The uncertainty was gone. All that was left was the fight. "This paper," she said, pointing to the locket in his hand. "My husband told me his grandfather didn't buy their land. He said he won it, in a card game from a tribal elder who was desperate." River's eyes narrowed. He looked at the symbols again. "This isn't writing. It's a land survey. An old one. These symbols, they're native boundary markers." He looked at Minnow, a sudden, wild idea dawning on his face. "Minnow, what was your maiden name?" "Anasazi," she replied. "My people were from the southern canyons before we were forced north." River stared at her, then back at the paper, his mind racing. "The Callahan Ranch. The deed is held by a company, the AC Land Development Co. I always thought it was just a name. But what if it wasn't? What if AC stood for Anasazi Callahan?" The implication was staggering. "What if it wasn't a card game?" River said, his voice electric with the discovery. "What if it was a partnership agreement? A treaty? And this," he tapped the locket, "this is the original survey map. Proof that your people are the legal, joint owners of the entire valley. The wealth the Callahans built, it's half yours." This was the lie her husband had uncovered. This was why they killed him. He wasn't just going to leave with her. He was going to expose his own family and return what they had stolen. And this locket wasn't just a keepsake. It was a declaration of war. It was a claim. It was a weapon. A sharp crack echoed from outside. Not a gunshot. The sound of an axe splitting wood. But it was too close. Way too close. River grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, motioning for Minnow to get down. He peered through the crack. About 100 yards out, near the edge of the woods, a man was calmly chopping firewood. He wasn't one of the townsfolk. He was dressed in the expensive, tailored clothes of a city man. Behind him, another man was setting up a camp tent. Then another. And another. They weren't hiding. They weren't sneaking up on the cabin. They were setting up a siege. And standing by the fire, directing them all, was a tall, silver-haired man with a cruel, thin smile. Even from this distance, Minnow recognized him. It was Silas Callahan, her father-in-law. The war had come home. The arrival of the Callahans changed the texture of the air. The threat was no longer a shadowy mob of angry townsfolk. It was a professional, well-equipped force. Silas Callahan hadn't come alone. He'd brought a dozen hired guns, men with cold eyes and worn holsters, who moved with the casual menace of predators. They didn't attack. That wasn't Silas's style. He preferred to squeeze. He set up his camp just outside of rifle range, a clear and constant presence. They were a visible promise of violence to come. The town, which had been hostile before, was now paralyzed with fear. Sheriff Rohr was no longer in charge. He was just another one of Silas's errand boys, his face a constant sneer of vindicated hatred. No one dared to go near River's cabin. The road was watched. The woods were patrolled. They were cut off. An island in a sea of enemies. Inside, the tension was a physical thing. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, sounded like an approaching footstep. The girls could feel it, their laughter replaced by a watchful quiet. "He's waiting us out," River said, cleaning his rifle for the 10th time. "He wants us to get hungry, desperate. He wants us to make a mistake." "He thinks we are trapped," Minnow replied, her hands busy grinding their last handful of corn into meal. "He doesn't know this land. My people did not just live on it. We were a part of it." She knew things Silas Callahan couldn't imagine. She knew the game trails the deer used, hidden paths that were invisible to the untrained eye. She knew which plants that grew under the snow could be eaten, which roots could be boiled for a bitter but nourishing tea. While Silas saw an empty frozen wasteland, Minnow saw a pantry and a network of secret roads. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, she slipped out. River stood watch, his heart pounding with a fear he hadn't felt in years. She moved like a shadow, silent and swift, melting into the darkness of the forest. An hour later she returned, her sack filled with dried berries, roots, and 2 rabbits she had caught in snares she'd made from vines. They weren't just surviving, they were fighting back. But Silas was playing a different game. The next morning a rider approached the cabin under a white flag. It was Sheriff Rohr. "Callahan wants to talk," he shouted from a safe distance. "Just talk. He'll meet you at the creek. Alone." River looked at Minnow. It was a trap. They both knew it. "I'll go," River said. "No," Minnow countered, her voice firm. "He wants you. He expects you. He won't be expecting me." Before River could argue, she was pulling on her thickest cloak. "He thinks of me as a weak, grieving widow. Let him keep thinking that. It's the best weapon we have." She walked out into the cold morning air, her head held high. River watched from the window, his rifle ready, every muscle in his body screaming for him to stop her. But he trusted her. He had to. At the frozen creek, Silas Callahan was waiting, flanked by 2 of his gunmen. He looked Minnow up and down, a look of contempt on his face. "My dear Minoki," he said, his voice slick with false sympathy. "This has gone on long enough. I've come to take you home. You and my granddaughters. This savage life is not for you." "This is my home now," Minnow replied, her voice as cold as the ice under her feet. Silas's smile tightened. "Don't be a fool. The man you're with is a wanted murderer, a federal fugitive. Did you know that? He's using you. Give me what my son left you, and I'll let you walk away. I'll even give you some money, enough to disappear." He was talking about the locket, he knew. "My husband left me nothing but memories," Minnow said, her face a perfect mask of innocence. Silas's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer. "I am a patient man, but my patience is wearing thin. That cabin is made of dry wood. It would be a shame if a stray spark were to land on it while my granddaughters were sleeping inside. Give me the locket, Minoki." The threat was naked, brutal, but Minnow didn't flinch. She just stared at him, a strange, pitying look in her eyes. "You think this is about a piece of land, don't you, Silas? You think it's about money." She reached into her cloak. For a second, Silas's men tensed, their hands going to their guns. But she didn't pull out a weapon. She pulled out a small, crudely carved wooden bear. One of the toys River had made for Nay. She held it out. "This is what this is about." a home, a family, something your money can't buy and your guns can't take. You lost your son because you never understood that. And now you're going to lose everything else. She turned her back on him and walked away, leaving him standing there, his face a thundercloud of rage. She had refused his offer. She had insulted his power. She had just signed their death warrant. The moment Minnow returned to the cabin, the tone of the siege shifted. The pretense of negotiation was over. Callahan's men began to tighten the circle, their patrols more aggressive. Warning shots would ring out if so much as a shadow moved near the cabin windows. The pressure was immense. The small world inside those four walls became their entire universe. But it wasn't a world of despair. It was a world of preparation. River took the coded paper from the locket and studied it for hours, cross-referencing it with an old survey map of the territory he'd had tucked away in his saddlebags. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to decipher it. The symbols weren't just boundary markers. They were a story. They told of water rights, mineral deposits, and a sacred burial ground located right in the center of what was now the Callahan Ranch. "This is more than just a deed, Minnow," he said, his voice low with awe. "This is the soul of this valley. It's irrefutable. If we can get this to a circuit judge, it would not only give you your land back, it would unravel Silas's entire empire." But the nearest circuit judge was a week's ride away, in a world they couldn't reach. As River worked on the map, Minnow worked on their survival. She showed him how to use the reflection of a knife blade to watch the patrols without being seen. She made poultices from crushed herbs for his still-healing wound. They moved around each other in the small space with an unspoken rhythm, a partnership forged in the crucible of their shared danger. One night, a blizzard rolled in, a monster of wind and snow that blotted out the world. The visibility dropped to zero. "This is it," River said, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous light. "This is our chance. No one can see a thing out there. I can slip through their lines in this." "You are not going alone," Minnow stated, already bundling the sleeping girls in their thickest blankets. "Minnow, it's too dangerous." "It is more dangerous to stay," she countered. "Silas will expect you to try to run for help. He will have men watching the main trails, even in this storm. But he won't expect us to run towards him." He saw the logic in her words, and the sheer, breathtaking audacity of it. "What are you suggesting?" "There is an old hunter's line cabin, deep in the woods," she explained, pointing to a spot on River's map. "It's on Callahan land. No one has used it in years. We can get there without being seen if we use the low gullies. From there we can watch them. We can choose our own time to fight, not wait for them to choose for us." It was a crazy plan, a desperate gamble, but it was better than waiting to be burned alive. They moved in the heart of the storm. River carried one of the sleeping girls and Minnow carried the other, their few supplies bundled on their backs. The wind was a physical force trying to push them back, and the snow was so thick they could barely see their own feet. But Minnow navigated by instinct, by the feel of the ground and the angle of the wind. She was in her element. They moved like ghosts through the whiteout, passing within 50 feet of Callahan's camp. They could hear the muffled shouts of the guards, could smell the smoke from their fires, but they were invisible, swallowed by the storm. Hours later, half frozen and exhausted, they stumbled upon it. A small, dilapidated cabin, barely more than a shack, hidden in a thick grove of pines. It was derelict, but it had four walls and a roof. It was a sanctuary. As the first light of dawn broke, the blizzard began to subside. River peered out a crack in the wall towards their old cabin, and his blood ran cold. Silas Callahan, enraged at finding them gone, had made his move. The cabin, their home, was engulfed in flames, a funeral pyre burning against the morning snow. Silas and his men were standing there, watching it burn, believing their enemies were turning to ash inside. They thought they had won. They thought River and Minnow were dead. And that was a mistake that was going to cost them dearly. From the hidden vantage point of the line cabin, they watched. They saw Silas and his men sift through the ashes of the burned cabin, looking for bones for any proof of their victory. Finding nothing, a confusion began to spread through the camp. Sheriff Rohr argued with Silas, his voice carrying on the cold, clear air. They were spooked. A giant of a man, A native woman and 2 children couldn't just vanish into thin air. To the superstitious gunman, it felt like black magic. "They're afraid," Minnow whispered, a grim satisfaction in her voice. "Good. Fear makes men sloppy." They had a few days' reprieve. While Callahan's men searched the valley in ever-widening circles, River and Minnow planned. The element of surprise was their only weapon now, and they had to use it perfectly. "Silas won't leave," River reasoned. "Not without the locket. He can't be sure we died in the fire, and as long as that paper exists, his entire world is built on a foundation of sand. He'll tear this entire valley apart looking for us." "Then we must bring the law to him," Minnow said. River looked at her. "The nearest town with a telegraph is 50 miles away. I'd never make it through his patrols." "You won't have to," she replied. She pointed on the map. "There's a relay station for the stagecoach line. Just over this ridge. It's only 10 miles. They'll have a telegraph there." It was still a huge risk, but it was their only one. The plan was simple and insane. Minnow, who could move through the woods undetected, would make the journey to the relay station. River would stay behind and create a diversion. A big one. Something that would draw every one of Callahan's men away from the trail she needed to take. "No," River said immediately. "It's a suicide mission. For both of us." "We are already dead, remember?" she said, her eyes locking with his. "This is the only way. I can do this, River. You have to trust me." He looked at her, at the unwavering strength in her face. This wasn't the broken woman he had found on his porch. This was a warrior. He finally nodded, his heart a cold lump of dread in his chest. With the girls hidden safely in a small, dry cave Minnow knew of near the line cabin, they prepared. Minnow dressed in dark clothes, her face smudged with charcoal. She carried only a knife in the locket, tied securely around her neck. River, meanwhile, gathered what he could: dry wood, pine sap, a few stray bullets he'd found in the abandoned cabin. He was going to light a fire that Silas Callahan would see from miles away. They stood together at the edge of the woods as dusk fell. There were no words left to say. He just reached out and grasped her shoulder, his thumb brushing her cheek. It was a gesture of farewell, of trust, of something more that neither of them dared to name. Then she was gone, a ghost in the twilight. River watched until she disappeared. Then he turned, his face set like granite, and walked towards the Callahan ranch. He wasn't just creating a diversion. He was a man with nothing left to lose, walking back into the heart of the fire. He was going to end this one way or another. He was going to burn Silas Callahan's world to the ground. River moved with a predator's patience. He circled wide around the Callahan ranch house, using the terrain, staying in the shadows. The main house was lit up, a fortress of light in the vast darkness. Guards were posted everywhere, jumpy and on edge since the cabin fire. But they were all looking outward, watching the wilderness for ghosts. They weren't watching their own back door. River's target wasn't the house. It was the massive barn 100 yards away. It was filled with this winter's hay, Callahan's entire feed supply for his vast herds of cattle. It was the heart of his financial empire. Without it, his cattle would starve before the spring thaw. It was also a tinderbox. He crept closer, his movements slow and deliberate. A dog barked, and he froze, melting into the shadow of a water trough. The guard cursed the dog, threw a rock in its direction, and went back to staring into the darkness. River reached the barn. The main doors were barred, but he found a small hayloft window that had been left unlatched. With a strength that seemed almost inhuman, he pulled himself up, silent as an owl, and slipped inside. The barn was dark, filled with the sweet smell of hay and the soft sounds of sleeping animals. He worked quickly, piling dry tinder, soaking it with oil from a nearby lantern. He created a chain of small fires that would all lead to the main hayloft. He was about to light the first one when he heard voices outside the main door. "The boss is getting spooked," one voice said. "He wants us to double the watch. Thinks that Marshall is still out there." "He's dead," a second voice grumbled. "Both of them. Just ghosts. Now we're stuck here freezing for nothing." The bar on the door scraped open. 2 men walked in, lanterns held high. River flattened himself in the hayloft, holding his breath. The men did a cursory check of the stalls below, their lantern light sweeping across the floor. It came to rest on a set of fresh tracks in the dust, tracks leading from the wall to the center of the barn. The men stopped. They looked at the tracks, then slowly, their eyes wide with fear, they looked up, straight at the hayloft where River was hiding. One of them opened his mouth to shout. He never made a sound. River dropped from the loft like a hawk, a silent dark shape falling from the sky. He landed on the man, taking him down in a heap. The second man fumbled for his pistol, but River was already moving, a blur of motion in the dim light. The fight was over in seconds. Both men were left unconscious, but alive. River didn't have time to be careful now. He lit the fire. The dry tinder caught instantly. The flame raced along the oil-soaked path he'd made, climbing the walls, reaching for the hayloft. The whole structure went up with a deafening whoosh. Flames exploded out of the windows, turning night into a terrifying fiery day. Alarms shouted from the main house. Men poured out, their faces illuminated by the inferno. Chaos erupted, just as River had planned. He slipped out the back of the burning barn, using the confusion as cover. He could hear Silas Callahan screaming orders, his voice raw with fury. They were all focused on the fire, on trying to save what couldn't be saved. No one was watching the trails. The path for Minnow was clear. River didn't run. He walked calmly into the woods, the roar of the fire at his back. He didn't look back. The fire was a message, a promise. I'm still here, and I'm coming for you. He had done his part. Now everything depended on a woman with a locket, making her way through 10 miles of frozen darkness. Minnow ran. The glow of the burning barn behind her was a beacon, a horrifying and beautiful signal that River had succeeded. It spurred her on, her feet finding purchase on the icy ground, her lungs burning from the cold air. She moved through the forest not like a stranger, but like someone coming home. Every tree, every rock was a familiar landmark from a life she thought she'd lost. She avoided the open trails, sticking to the deep woods, her senses alive to every sound, every movement. Twice she had to hide, pressing herself into the snow as patrols of Callahan's men rode past, their faces grim in the moonlight, drawn like moths to the distant flame of the fire. They were angry, disorganized, and not paying attention. River's diversion was working perfectly. Hours later, exhausted and shivering, she saw it, a faint light through the trees, the stagecoach relay station. It was a small, fortified building, little more than a stable and a small office. But to her, it looked like a city. She approached cautiously. A single light burned in the window. She peered inside. An old man sat hunched over a telegraph machine, his face tired. She knocked on the door. The man jumped, startled. He opened the door a crack, a shotgun in his hands. "We're closed for the night." "Please," Minnow said, her voice hoarse. "It's an emergency. I need to send a message." The man looked at her smudged face and torn cloak. He saw the desperation in her eyes. He hesitated, then slowly lowered the shotgun and let her in. "Who are you sending a message to at this hour?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "The federal courthouse in Springfield," she said, pulling the locket from under her shirt. "To Circuit Judge Henry Wallace. Tell him Marshal River McGraw is alive. Tell him I have the evidence. The Callahan case. Tell him to come now." The old telegraph operator's eyes went wide at the mention of the judge's name, and wider still at the name McGraw. He knew the stories. Everyone in the territory did. He looked from Minnow's determined face to the locket in her hand. He nodded slowly, a new respect dawning in his eyes. He turned to his machine. The clicking began, a small sound in the vast silence of the prairie, a sound that was about to bring an empire crashing down. As the message clicked its way across the wires, Minnow sank into a chair, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. But she knew she couldn't rest. She had to get back. Back to her children, back to River. The operator gave her a cup of hot, bitter coffee. "It'll take the judge 3 days of hard riding to get here, ma'am, if he even comes at all." "He'll come," Minnow said with a certainty that surprised even herself. "Now, I need to buy some things. Rope, lantern oil, and every box of rifle cartridges you have." The old man looked at her, a question in his eyes. "The ghosts are going hunting," she said. The 3 days it would take for the judge to arrive were the longest of River's life. He and Minnow fortified the line cabin, turning it into a defensible position. They had the ammunition she'd brought back, 2 rifles, and the terrain on their side. They also had Callahan's rage. The burned barn had sent Silas into a fury. He now knew for certain they were alive. His men swept through the woods, no longer searching, but hunting. They were clumsy, loud city gunmen, but there were a lot of them. The first attack came at dawn on the second day. They tried a frontal assault on the cabin, thinking they could overwhelm it with sheer numbers. It was a foolish mistake. River and Minnow were positioned on the high ground, behind rocks and trees. They fired with deadly accuracy, not to kill, but to wound, to demoralize. The attackers fell back in disarray, dragging their injured, cursing the woods and the phantoms within it. They had underestimated them. They thought they were fighting a single marshal. They didn't realize they were also fighting a woman who knew every inch of this land, who could appear and disappear at will. That afternoon, Sheriff Rohr tried a different tactic. He rode out with a white flag, his arm in a crude sling. "Callahan wants the children," he yelled. "He says he'll let you two go if you give him his granddaughters. He just wants his family back." It was a sick, twisted lie, and they all knew it. "He's trying to split us," River muttered. Minnow stepped out from behind the rocks, her rifle held ready. "Tell Silas Callahan that if any of his men come within 100 yards of our children, I will burn the rest of his ranch to the ground, with him inside it." Her voice, clear and strong, echoed through the valley. Rohr stared at her, his face a mixture of fear and hatred. He turned and fled. The final night was quiet. Too quiet. The attacks had stopped. The patrols had vanished. "It's a trick," River said, scanning the dark woods. "He's pulling back, trying to make us think he's given up. He wants us to get complacent." "He is planning something for the morning," Minnow agreed. "Something final." They didn't sleep. They sat together, watching the darkness, the sleeping girls bundled between them. The silence was heavy with unspoken words. In the face of death, all pretense was stripped away. "Minnow," River said, his voice soft, "I'm sorry. I brought all this on you. If I had never opened my door that night—" She stopped him, placing a hand on his arm. "You did not bring this on me. You opened a door when the entire world had slammed theirs in my face. You gave me a home, if only for a few weeks. You showed my daughters that not all men are cruel. Whatever happens tomorrow, you have already saved us." He looked at her in the pale moonlight, and he saw not a victim, but an equal, a partner. The attack began just before dawn. It wasn't a clumsy rush this time. They used fire. Arrows wrapped in oil-soaked rags arched through the sky, thudding into the trees and rocks around the cabin, trying to flush them out into the open. The woods began to burn. Smoke filled the air, choking them, stinging their eyes. Callahan's men advanced behind the wall of fire and smoke, their figures like demons in the haze. This was the end. They were trapped. River and Minnow fired back, making every shot count, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. The circle of fire and men was closing in. River took a bullet in the shoulder, the impact spinning him around. He staggered but kept firing. Through the smoke, Silas Callahan appeared, flanked by Sheriff Rohr and a half-dozen of his best men. He had a torch in his hand. "It's over, McGraw," he roared. "The judge isn't coming. Your message never got through. Now give me the locket, and I'll give you a quick death." It was a lie, a final desperate attempt to break their will. River laughed, a ragged, painful sound. "You're a fool, Silas. You think this was about me?" He looked at Minnow. This was it, their last stand. And then they heard it, a whistle, sharp and clear, cutting through the roar of the fire and the crack of gunshots. And then another, and another, from all sides. Silas and his men froze. They looked around, confused. Through the smoke, figures began to emerge from the trees. They weren't soldiers. They were townsfolk. The blacksmith, the storekeeper, the timid doctor, even some of the farmers from the outlying homesteads. They were armed with hunting rifles, shotguns, and pitchforks. They weren't a militia. They were just ordinary people who had finally had enough. The old telegraph operator had done more than just send a message to the judge. He had sent one to every homesteader on the line. He had told them the truth about River, about Minnow, and about the tyrant who was trying to burn their valley down. Sheriff Rohr looked at the closing ring of angry faces, his own constituents, and his courage finally broke. He threw down his gun and ran. Silas Callahan stared in disbelief. His army of hired guns, seeing the tables turn so dramatically, began to back away, melting into the woods. Soon it was just Silas, standing alone amidst the smoke, surrounded. He looked from the angry townsfolk to River and Minnow, his face contorted in a mask of pure, undiluted hatred. He raised his pistol, aiming it straight at Minnow. A single gunshot echoed through the clearing. Silas collapsed, a neat hole in the center of his chest. Standing on the ridge behind him, holding a smoking rifle, was the old doctor, his hands steady for the first time in years. The fight was over. In the aftermath, the world seemed to hold its breath. The townsfolk stamped out the last of the fires, their faces grim but resolute. They had taken back their town. As the smoke cleared, a wagon appeared on the trail. In it sat a stern-looking man with a white beard and the unmistakable air of authority. Judge Henry Wallace had arrived, flanked by a squad of federal marshals. He had gotten the message. The cleanup was swift and absolute. Sheriff Rohr was found hiding in a cellar and was arrested. Callahan's hired guns were rounded up. The locket and the paper within it was presented to the judge. The truth, buried for a generation, was finally brought into the light. The Callahan empire, built on a foundation of lies, crumbled to dust. The valley was returned to its rightful owners, the descendants of the Anasazi people, with Minnow as their steward. Weeks later, the snow began to melt, revealing the first green shoots of spring. A traveling preacher stopped at the rebuilt cabin, the one the town had helped raise from the ashes. In the warm morning sun, River and Minnow stood before him. Ya and Nay, dressed in new dresses sewn by the women of the town, stood between them, holding their hands. The vows they spoke were not fancy. They were simple words about sharing food and warmth, about facing storms together, about building a home. Later, as they stood on the porch looking out at the valley that was now theirs, Minnow confessed the fear that had once haunted her. "I thought no man would accept me with children." River, his arm healing in a sling, simply smiled. He didn't need to say anything. His actions had spoken louder than 1,000 words. He had seen her not as a burden, but as a warrior. He hadn't saved her. They had saved each other. Their story became a legend in that valley. A story about how a silent giant and a determined widow stood against a tyrant and won. It's a reminder that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about standing your ground even when you're terrified, and that sometimes the greatest strength can be found in the quietest people. The world will try to cast you out, to tell you that you're not enough, but a single heart, a single person who chooses to stand with you can be stronger than any army. If you found strength in this story and believe in the power of standing up for what's right, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You never know when you'll need a reminder that even in the coldest winter, spring is always waiting.